So the first question is from Mary in Austin. Mary.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought that they took it and were going to read it to you.
Well, I want everybody to be able to hear it, so I'm gonna let you go. That way, the audience is in on the
Okay.
conversation.
All right. I understand that there's some legislation in Congress now that is going to urge President Trump to keep America in agreement with in agreement with the Paris Climate Accord. And I was just wondering where you stand on that, and what is the status of that legislation, and where Congress is leaning, and your personal opinion about climate change and keeping America part of the global effort to reduce, carbon emissions and oil and gas and fracking and agribusiness and everything, and more people needing more fuel that is causing lots of problems for our planet in more ways than one. So just wanted to know where that legislation was and where you stand on it and what your feelings are.
Okay. Thanks, Mary, for the question, and you packed a lot into a question. I'm going to ask future questions if you can, to try to keep the question to about a minute so we get as many as we can. So let me unpack your question in the multiple components. The first one is, where do I stand on climate change? Let me say this. I believe that we're having climate change. I also believe that humankind is contributing to that climate change. And I believe that it's important for policymakers to try to do smart things to address policy change. So with respect to the bill that's on the floor tomorrow, it's called H.R. 9. H.R. 9 is basically designed to force a sense of the House that the president should be forced back into the Paris Climate Accord. That, in other words, that we should not leave. The president has announced that we're going to leave the Paris Climate Accord, and the House is trying to force him to stop that action. I am going to vote no. I disagree with this approach. The Paris Climate Accord is not the solution to climate change. Here's a simple reason why. Most of the big polluters that we have, namely India, China, and Russia, are going to be allowed to keep increasing their emissions all the way through 2030. While we, on the other hand, as Americans, already have a demonstrated track record of reducing our emissions by close to 20% over the last several years. So we already have a track record of being able to do it. Why should we be tied into an accord where some countries continue to get to have higher emissions, but we have to reduce? We all need to be in this together. And what we as Americans need to do is set an example of how to do this, because we've already proved that it can be done. We can have a growing economy and reduce emissions. Now, how do we do this? Number one is, let's invest more in innovation to find new ways to use energy more efficiently, with an emphasis on research and development. So new energy, and we need to find a storage source other than lithium batteries. So let's invest in storage technology on the research and development side. Let's look at the real secret to zero emissions electric generation is nuclear power. And I'm not talking about today's nuclear power. I'm talking about next generation nuclear power. We've got new generation reactor designs, and we have small modular reactors that are the key to the future. Now, we're going to have to do a lot of things. We've got to change the way the licensing process works. We've got to speed up research and development. We've got to have new fuels for those reactors. Those are the types of things we can do. This can be bipartisan too, because you find bipartisan support here in Congress for an expansion of new generation nuclear power. We need to look at conservation. Conservation is the cheapest and most efficient way to reduce emissions, because you're not using the power to start the energy to start with. We also need to look at adaptation. I mean, if you look at the Paris Climate Accord, it appears that it's not going to really change based on some of the scientific analysis we're seeing. It's really not going to change. It changes the trajectory of carbon emissions, but it really doesn't change the change in the climate. And so we're going to do something to try to address climate change. We ought to do something that's actually going to have an impact on the climate. And so those are the types of things I think we need to do. Also, I've got kind of an interesting graphic that comes from NASA's Earth website that for those of you that are watching this on video can see it. If you look at this, it shows you that nature emits about 30 times as much carbon in the atmosphere as humankind does. So the other thing that we need to look at, we're looking at climate change, is how do we look at the other sources of carbon emissions? And that I think is a key component. So if nature is emitting 200 plus gigatons a year in carbon in the air, and mankind is emitting 9, then we need to look at the 200 as well as the 9. So those are things that I think we need to take a look at. Also, with respect to adaptation, there are some times where adapting to climate change may be better for jobs, better for the economy, better for the environment than trying to mitigate climate change. Because sometimes you don't know if a policy decision or an expenditure is going to change the climate. But for instance, we know what hurricanes can do to the Gulf Coast. So the Ike dike, in other words, adapting to climate change may be a better thing than trying to, or maybe a more proven approach to protect people and property from the effects of climate change. So I'm sorry that was a long answer, but you did ask a lot in there. We're going to take an online question now. This is from Kalpana, and Kalpana, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. It says, please support the House Bill Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It charges a carbon fee and returns all the money to American households and create jobs. Kalpana, thank you for the recommendation. I hate to say this, but I would not support that bill. Here's why. If you look at the inputs into a modern economy, you have people, you have capital, money, you have technology, you have intellectual property, you have education. One of those key components is energy. If you raise the cost of energy by imposing a carbon tax, you raise the cost of everything. So it hurts lower and middle income families the worst. So think the cost of a gallon of milk goes up, the cost of driving their car goes up, the cost of owning a home goes up, the cost of educating their kids goes up. All of those things happen. And then if you do it with the promise that you're going to get some dividend back from Washington, I don't trust those promises. And how does the family live on those increased costs while they're waiting for the dividend to come in? Is it going to come in quarterly? Is it going to come in annually? What's the deal? I mean, how's it going to work? I don't think it's a good solution. You hear a lot of people trying to advocate that, but I can't do anything to the constituents of Texas that's going to drive their living cost up, particularly for low and middle income families. So I'm against that. Again, I go back to my original thesis. Let's focus on conservation, innovation, research and development, a focus on next generation nuclear power. Let's try to find ways to use existing energy resources more cleanly, more efficiently, and let's look at spending for adaptation. That would be a much better, more practical solution that wouldn't have any adverse economic impact on hardworking families. So that's my solution.